This week, we are pre-recording a fabulous episode. I can't wait to do a tech segment on updating Linux systems beyond apt-get upgrade, go through some custom scripts and things that I do to keep my Linux systems up to date. Continuing on the Linux topic, we will talk about anti-malware, antivirus, and or EDR on Linux platforms, driven by the PCI requirement for scanning Linux systems. Talk about some things you can do to meet that requirement or things we can do to make that requirement better. Stay tuned, all that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. Coming to you from the Hacker Syndicate Studios, this is Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 877, being recorded on Wednesday, May 28th, 2025. Of course, you're hearing this being aired the first week in June. I'm, of course, Paul Sidorian, joined by Josh Morpeth. Josh, welcome.
Hey, always happy to be here. What a fun time.
Nice to have you. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us.
Hello, glad to be here.
Mr. Jeff Mann.
Hello from the past.
Miss Mandy Logan.
All right. Hello from the future. And this is awesome. See you guys in the morning. It's a different whole thing, right?
It is. It's morning time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's
I'm
weird.
not awake
It's
yet.
good, though. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Hey, good morning, all. Even though it's whatever time it is when you actually hear this episode, hey, I'm loving we're doing this in the morning because tonight we're going to see Tommy James and the Shondells.
Nice.
Oh, damn, nice.
He's still alive?
Yeah.
Jesus, that's not a nice thing.
Well, I mean, he's from early 60s.
Wait, Jeff is here? Is he still alive?
Is he still alive?
He's from the early 60s.
Thank God he is, and thank God you're here
Newsflash,
with us.
Jeff, we're also from the early 60s.
Yeah, we were born in the early 60s. He was performing in the early 60s, which means he's got to be in his
I was born
80s.
in the 70s. If you're watching the video, I've got my new Star Wars Dark Side jersey that I found.
Ah,
At this
that's
little
freaking
issue
cool.
77.
It's like a little boutique shop in the
Yes,
mall.
I
'Cause my
watched-
kids are at the age where they're going to the mall, so I was at the mall, and I'm like, oh, that store had some really cool Star Wars gear, and I was like, it's on sale. My wife's like, I'm moving on. I
So,
can't.
store at the
Be
mall
with
with
the store.
Star Wars gear. Hot
Yeah.
topic by any chance?
Yeah, how nerdy is that? Speaking of
Well-
nerdy stuff, we've got first an announcement.
Mhm.
Cyber threats move fast. Are your credentials already out there? Join Channel ETE and Flare for Tales from the Dark Web, a live webcast revealing how info stealer malware and account takeovers happen and how to stop them. See real-time demos, learn proactive defense strategies, and discover how Flare's identity intelligence can keep your data safe. June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register at securityweekly.com/darkweb. So, nerdy and fun things keeping Linux systems up to date. So let me set the stage a little bit about how I came to have this challenge and solve this problem. So I have 4 desktop laptops, like daily drivers, I guess you can say. So I have 2 desktops, one here at my home office, one at the studio, and I have 2 laptops. I think I ended up with 2 laptops because I love Framework so much that when they came out with laptops, I had to buy them. And now I have 2 of them, and I want more and I want to upgrade them, but it's expensive, and the ones I have work amazing. So I have a Framework 13, a Framework 16, Home is like my 24 core Threadripper that you can go to securitypodcaster.com and get the full specs. I still like with a 24 core Threadripper and 256 gigs of RAM. The system is about 5 years old, and I still am not like clamoring to upgrade it because it still runs fine. And I built it for like roughly $4,000. So if you take that budget and you try and build a system equivalent to that, let alone better today, you're looking at least 6,000 plus.
$500.
$500 for what?
That's
No,
his budget.
no. That's
I
your
can build a
budget.
system better than that for $500.
We'll do it. We can do a tech segment on that.
Ooh,
but
yeah.
yeah. So then the other one, like I inherited when we took over the studio, it has a 4090 in it, and it's an i9, and all of those run Manjaro Linux. So that's what started me down having the need I need to keep all these systems up to date. I don't have time for shenanigans. Like I have to make this as easy as error free and less error prone as possible. So there's that. Then also driving the studio, there's a whole bunch of systems, right? So there's like 3 Ubuntu systems on 4 Ubuntu systems on set. 2 of those get Larry and I in Riverside. One is for the teleprompter to read notes that I can also share on the broadcast, and the other one runs Slack. Now I could do that all on one system, except getting on Riverside requires a separate system. And also I like to keep things separated because if something crashes, it's one component, not everything. So then I've got a couple of jump boxes at the studio.
Quick question, Paul, if I may interject. Ballpark, how many flavors of Linux are out there these days?
Quite a few. Probably over 100.
There was a lot. I was just
over
looking that up.
100.
Like, yeah,
Over
last
100?
week.
I think you can go to, there's a website for that. Is it
Yeah.
DistroWatch? DistroWatch, I believe.
Yeah. That I was just
is the
going through
website.
that last
And how
week
many
and
do you have
looking
to
at-
pay for?
I don't know.
Not many. Well, there's ones you can pay for.
Mm-hmm.
Red Hat Enterprise Linux might be the one that you have to. Do you have to pay for that?
No,
Mhm.
you
don't, right?
For RHEL, for support, you have to pay for a license. However, if you pay for it and then stop paying for it, you can still run it. It just you're not supported anymore.
Right.
However,
Canonical has a model where you can pay for support and extended support. I forget what they call that. I actually forget what they call it, but because I don't use it. So yeah.
Carry on. I was just curious.
Yeah. So, and then it came time for me to start trying to update all of these systems, and short of running some kind of commercial or like really fancy tool, because I don't have 10,000 systems in an enterprise, right? I have commercial wise, I like Automox. I mean, they don't sponsor the show; they used to, but I have used Automox, and I do like Automox as a tool. And I think what happened was I was using Automox. It's a great point. I was using Automox, but I had carried a license when we were Security Weekly, got acquired by CRA, and then eventually we did not renew Automox because I wasn't maintaining any systems for the business anymore. That got all taken over. So I was on my own. So the first thing that I did was start creating, I'm going to share my screen. I started creating a shell script, which I can release. I haven't put it in a GitHub yet, but I will. And so the first thing I did was I created this shell script called update.sh. And essentially this is tuned for Manjaro systems. You could easily tune this to be any Arch Linux distribution. I did have plans. I was going to start making it like a cross distribution script, but then I found a better tool. So right now I still use this just to update my Manjaro systems because I like what I customized and built into this script. So if I'm just updating one system and I don't want to update all of them, I still fall back to this script. And one of the things that I noticed when I started using Manjaro was I had a better experience if I updated and did a sync of all the mirrors. So I told it to go out, find all the mirrors. It does like a speed test to all of them. It finds the fastest ones and then populates your database. with a fresh list of mirrors, right? Because mirrors are like a huge list of things. Some may be up, some might be down, some might be updated with the latest packages, some might not be. So doing pacman dash mirrors space dash F will not just update your mirror list, but also the dash F will select the fastest ones. I have also tuned my mirrors to be US only. Some of that is a little bit of paranoia. Some of that is I feel like I just get the fastest ones. It also cuts down the list. It makes this command, I think, run a little faster. So what I'm going to do is I have a Linux cheat sheet that I keep for myself that I'm also going to publish as part of my talk that I'm giving next week. Although that would be this week. Actually today,
That you already
Which is
gave.
why we're not here.
Depending on when you're listening to this, I probably have already given my talk sometime in the future. And so I will release the cheat sheet, probably this script into like a GitHub repository. I should probably just put my slides out there. I should probably just make a GitHub repository and put it. Hopefully by the time you're listening to this, there's a GitHub repository with some things out there to help you. Okay, so then I use PA Mac, which is the tool specific to Manjaro. Pacman is the one specific to Arch Linux. You could use either or both. I like using PA Mac to update Manjaro. So I run that command with the -A, which upgrades all packages. -A is upgrading AUR. That's the Arch user repository. So every time I do a system update, it's the system packages that come from Manjaro and any packages I've installed from AUR or the Arch user repository. I enable downgrade, which allows PAMac to downgrade a component if it needs to satisfy a requirement. I did an upgrade and it required that, and so I just put it in there every time now.
Studio.
Oh God, yeah. I can't believe we'll talk about that later maybe. But and then I do a force refresh, which forces all the local package database to refresh for good measure. All things that like I've run into issues, researched the solution, and it was like, oh, you need to run PAMac with -- refresh. So I'm like, okay, just do that every time.
So, question for you.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
I was looking ahead on PAMac, and it's got both the command line, which I figured you'd be all over, and it's also got a GUI. Would the GUI be helpful with folks trying to figure out?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. The first time users, you can absolutely use the GUI interface. There is one point of updating on my systems where I do use a GUI interface, which I could use a command line, but I kind of like using the GUI to update my kernel, and I'll show you exactly how that works.
Cool.
It's pretty cool. So,
yeah.
Paul,
the next
I've
thing,
got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
You seem to just be updating stuff without somehow testing it in a controlled environment to make sure it's not going to break anything important. That seems to violate Microsoft's recommendations for Windows. Is that really okay on Linux? Because I found Linux updates to be pretty low quality and often breaking things.
Yeah, so it's a great point, Sam. It's a great point, Sam, because I should talk about my strategy, right? So I have, like I said, I have 4 systems. And so sometimes when it's a big update, I will go update one of my laptops that I'm not using at the moment, or I'll update my desktop, keep my laptop like plugged in, standing by. So if I have something critical to do, I may try the update. If it fails, I may just switch to another system, right? So that's kind of my backup is built in by just switching to another system. I also, before I do a major update, I should have pulled this up. Okay, I'm gonna pull this up because this is very important. And I can't believe I was going to gloss over this.
I can't believe it either, Paul.
I know, right? So when I do a major update, a stable update. So each time there's a Manjaro stable update, for example, the Manjaro forum gets a thread.
Who and how is it decided what's a stable update?
The Manjaro team decides that. So there's a team of folks. We interviewed someone who was on the security team. There's also the main distribution maintainers team. They take, so like upstream for us is Arch Linux. They take Arch Linux. They do some testing with it. And then they package all the packages and release stable updates and call it Manjaro. I used to have a blog post that had a great flow chart as to how they did that, which I should have included here, but I didn't. But when there's a major update, so if I run this command and it goes, you're updating like 25 packages or whatever, I'm like, oh, that looks like a stable update. I go to the Manjaro forums, announcements, stable updates, and I'm like, oh, like lo and behold, there's a stable update. This gives you all the information you need to read about what's in this update, what's being updated. One of the parts I like is it tells you like known issues, right? So this is the 519, doesn't currently have any known issues. The 412 update has a note about Grub that you should read. You must read. I can talk about that if we have time, but that's probably like could be a whole half an hour in and of itself talking about updating your bootloader. Okay. But you definitely want to read that. It doesn't get updated by default in Manjaro. You have to do it manually, but there's a script to do it. Install the package, install -grub. It'll help you do that. So anyway, so I come here and I read this. There's a voting thing. Yeah. So people will vote, like, did it go smoothly? Did it not go smoothly? So you can look at the results. Like 93% of the people who voted said it went smoothly. Like, okay, that's a good indicator. So I'm reading all this before I'm applying the update. And then you scroll down in the thread, and usually it's people asking the same or silly questions, not reading the manual, but there's an entire thread where people are working through any issue. So I go through and I read, all of this before I apply the update. So that's how I'm doing that. It's a great point. Okay. So back to the script. So after the update,
real quick, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead.
So kind of related to what Sam had asked. My understanding is that with using Pacman, it allows transactional updates, which means you can roll back, right?
I believe so. Sometimes when I read stable announcements, and I'll talk about that in my script, it'll say use Pacman for this update. Don't use PAMac, which is another reason why I stop and go, oh, there's a stable update. I have to go read and make sure I'm doing it correctly. There may be some other things that you have to do as part of that update. So yeah, Pacman is, I could do that every time. But again, I like the Manjaro tool just as much. Okay. So the next thing that it does is it runs a command called check rebuild. And what that does, it checks for packages that may have to be rebuilt. So you could run into a situation, this typically happens with Python, where Python will go from version 3.11 to version 3.12. And everything will update, and check rebuild, this command will run, and then go, hey, you've installed software before, and you've done that against Python 3.11 libraries, not Python 3.12 libraries. So you have to go back and rebuild those packages. Oftentimes, those are like security tools that I use that need that update. And so I run the check rebuild command. You can try and do that automatically. I have not had much luck, and you'll see the notes that I have later.
But Paul, aren't they running in Python virtual environments?
Well, there are the standard systems. A great question, Sam. The standard system packages will rely on the Python that's installed with the system. In other words, like Manjaro right now, I believe it's Python 3.13. Is that the one that we're on? I think it's 3.13. And so all of the packages that are installed through Pacman or PAMac will be built against 3.13, or if not, you have to just go rebuild it, right? If you then just git clone a repo and bring down some Python, I create a virtual environment for that every time. And the nice part is I can back rev the Python virtual environment. So I can do PAMac install Python 3.12, then I can go Python 3.12 -m env, then the name of the virtual environment, usually VNV, and it'll create me a Python 3.12 virtual environment. And I've gotten more stuff working that way.
So you'd have to have like a checklist of all the tools you have to rebuild, and you'd have to check each one to make sure it still works, right?
Yeah. So check rebuild will tell you what needs to be rebuilt.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you go, further down on the script, if you run this PAMac build command right here,
Yeah.
It will execute check rebuild and then use awk to just grab the name of all the packages that need to be rebuilt and automatically rebuild them. But again, that doesn't always work.
Yeah, and do you have automated unit tests to make sure that it still works after the rebuild? Because it seems like you'd need that.
No.
Yeah.
So what I would do in that case is like AUR Mailspring, sure, fine. So if I've installed a package typically from AUR, and this is another great question. I'm so glad you asked this because it's spawning like my workflow, right? And giving people insights into my workflow. So if I have a problem with a package or there's some dependency or whatever, you can go to Arch Linux and you can go to that package and there's a little discussion here. And usually people that have encountered errors or fixing things will post in here, and you'll either have a workaround or I can see like, has this package been updated lately? Like, oh, it hasn't. Like maybe there's a future update that might fix my issue. So maybe I need to just hold out for a while, right? Or maybe I need to switch which AUR package that I'm using, because oftentimes multiple people will package the same software slightly differently. Someone might keep up with it more than others. So that's my other tip, is make sure you check these pages for the packages you have installed, as that's also like where you'll find the answer to your questions. Like this one, like he's using patch elf to patch something to get something to work. Like you'll find tips like that in these pages.
Do you recommend install all the patches, stay up to date on the latest and greatest, like certain other operating systems?
Yeah, man. I'm moving forward. So Manjaro is what we call a rolling release. So there's just constantly new releases and new software coming out pretty much every day. My workflow is every time I sit down in front of my computer, the first thing I do is update it and get whatever the latest updates are to keep up with it.
Now, at scale, does that really work? Or
no? For desktops, I think that works great. If you're deploying thousands of Linux servers, you would not do it this way.
Right.
It's a good point, Jeff.
Weekly, monthly cadence.
Yeah. So I'm on like a every other day cadence as a desktop user. On my server side, I run Ubuntu. I updated it the same cadence, but Ubuntu's not pushing out as many packages. It's not a rolling release, right? So it's not pushing out as much stuff.
Do they indicate in any way when a rollout or an update is related to a security fix?
You get everything all at once, and there is no indication if it's a security fix. Okay. I know different distributions used to handle that differently. Like Jeff, remember when we worked at Tenable, right? They had VMs with all the Linux distributions running, and they would update it, and then they had scripts to go pull which updates were security, which ones weren't, and then they wrote plugins for the security updates.
Right.
Because I remember flagging certain things. I'm like, hey, why aren't we flagging on this? So like, oh, it wasn't flagged as a security update in the Linux distribution. So
because there's a certain segment of the population that is triggered by patches that are fixing especially critical security issues, and there's a certain framework out there that requires installation within 30 days. So most organizations that are falling under that, they want to know that the stuff's coming so they can respond to it correctly.
Right. Yeah, and that's why enterprises will use Red Hat Enterprise Linux or RHEL.
Okay.
It's a little more well tested, more suited for enterprise environments.
Well, there actually are also, I think, like is it Ubuntu long-term support that has less churn in the packages than say just the generic version. No offense, anybody. Because I was thinking, there's two ends of the scale. There's like what Paul, what you and I have talked about you're doing. You need that head-end Linux. It's got the latest stuff enabled because you're doing the stuff and making the stuff work that you're not going to get going in the Red Hat distribution because it's stable, rock solid, but it doesn't have all the latest support for the thing you want to play with.
Correct.
I mean, it was actually back where I used to work. The argument wasn't Arch Linux. It was, Fedora versus Red Hat. Your Fedora, same kind of behavior. Latest stuff, all the latest feature. Yeah, hundreds of patches a week, day, whatever. Very frequent.
Right.
Others must slow. It's kind of cool because Linux, you can support both environments. They just have different behavior.
Correct. Yeah, and so one thing you need to do, regardless of your update frequency, what'll happen is this packdiff command. And this has happened for 20 plus years, right? I first learned about this when I was updating Debian systems. A new package will come down from your package repository, and it will update a configuration file. And it doesn't automatically just clobber that configuration file in case you've made changes to that configuration file. What it does is store the new configuration in a separate file and then allow you to do a diff between them. And so the packdiff tool will actually do a diff. And topgrade does this too, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it'll say like, hey, I got an update for like Etsy host file. Like your Etsy host file is being updated. And I'm like, well, I made changes to mine. So like I have to merge those changes.
Right.
So that's another thing you have to consider when you're updating systems is not just the latest packages, but also you've got to do this merging of configuration files.
So are you checking this before you start the updates, or is this a post?
Post, yeah.
So it just says, hey, you got to go take a look at these 17 files. And
right. And you can do that at any time, and you can have it automated. You can be like, all right, go through all the ones that need update. Okay, I want to edit this one. I want to merge this one. I want to clobber that one. Like just put the new one over it or whatever. So you can make that. You can do that as like a manual step.
Is it? But it's not something that's like a crisis if you don't get to it right away these days.
No, you're right. Exactly.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Paul, this is all making me really nervous. Do you have some pattern of image-based backups so in case of catastrophe, you can roll it back to the way it was yesterday or something?
I do have some backup software that's tied to an external drive on at least one of my systems.
Where's that caveat? Don't try this at home.
Yeah. No, what is the...
I am trying this at home. It's kind of interestingly weird. Okay, let me tell you something.
And what is it called? Anachronopete is like the encrypted backup software. There's lots of different backup software. Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah.
Perhaps even have a comment at the top of your script if you actually crack it open and read it every time you do this. Don't forget to update. Don't forget to backup.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, major updates, I will initiate a backup. Although I have to say I've been using Manjaro for a long time. I'll talk about some built-in recovery mechanisms that I have. And you can also, on Linux, for example, I can just boot on a thumb drive and go access my files if I need to. I've had to do that before, certainly.
The other question I had real quick.
Mechanisms?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mandy.
Go
ahead,
Paul. Well, he said about the recovery mechanisms, and I was curious, is that something that a mechanism internal about, I am now going to have to use recovery, or you mean actual, like you mentioned USB, so you're talking about...
Yeah. So like I borked my system once because I encrypted the hard drive and something happened to the the keyboard driver and I couldn't enter my password to decrypt it. Because there was a bug. So I had to boot it on a removable media, mount the encrypted drive, then I could enter my password to decrypt it, and then I copied the files off and rebuilt my system. That was a long time ago, though, that happened. So
that was like
the other thing you should do is make sure your firmware is up to date. And this is something I don't like. This might be a manual step. I may just use this to tell me there's a firmware update, and then go kind of research it. But FWUpd or FWUpd, as people like to say, will enumerate the hardware on your system. And if the Linux firmware, Linux vendor firmware service has an update for it, it can apply those in addition to your DBX revocation list for secure boot. But again, I do a little more homework before I'm just willy-nilly applying firmware updates. I talked about the PAMAC build. That's the command if you want to use pacman for that. There's a one specific for rebuilding everything that was built against the older Python version. That's that command. What else? And just some other troubleshooting things that I had there. But yeah, so basically that's my script. So I was going to take my script and I was going to make it cross-platform, make it work on multiple Linux distributions, but then I found the tool called topgrade. And so I've
With the coolest
since
logo known to mankind.
it's freaking awesome, right? Like, why wouldn't you have a logo like that? So topgrade, we've talked about it
Copyright
before.
violation, perhaps.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
little bit,
exactly.
a little bit.
Just a
So,
thought.
this is written in Rust, and it is a cross-platform, cross Linux distribution updater that does almost all the things my script does. I don't think it updates my mirrors, but other than that, it does everything my script does and more. Right, so it goes into updating your Docker containers. If you've got Flatpak and Snap and apt packages, it will update all of those, and it will just march through your system. You can see it does cargo, like the whole thing. It enumerates your system for everything and updates it. So I'm really loving the topgrade command. One of the things I like, so this was a topgrade command that I ran earlier on my system. And you can see it updates my VS Code extensions, right? I use an open source version of VS Code called VS Codium. It'll update those. It tries to, I've got a little bit of work to do. Like it doesn't update my Google Cloud utility. It doesn't update my ClamAV database correctly. It did update my platform IO. So that's my build environment. It'll go and update that, all kinds of other stuff. So I run this command. But I want to look at this feature of topgrade, and one of the things I love is this thing called remote upgrades. So as not to
Remote
preserve
top grades.
Your top grades, right? So, but in order not to leak all the names of my servers and systems, I created some fake ones using an LLM. It's important when you're using the Alderon temp system not to store anything important. Also, that system tends to run a little hot. But what you can do with the remote upgrades is list out. So if I've configured my SSH config to be able to SSH into these systems using a key, SSH key, and not a password, you could do it with a password, but it's easier with a key. I configure all the system names here. When I run topgrade, if topgrade's installed on all these systems, which I've done, it will update all of your remote systems. So with one command, I run topgrade like on this system, and it will march through all of my Linux systems, execute topgrade, and step you through doing that. So again, it's kind of a poor man's system management. I've got a handful of systems. And I'll march through and upgrade those. And that's how I do it using topgrade.
Look at that. That's not bad, man.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I got to tell you, that's pretty cool. On the other hand, I mean, you just buy Intune for Windows.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
you
again,
said the B word.
Like Automox was a thing. I mean, there's
I know.
I can use. There's a million different ways to update Linux systems, right? This is just.
I mean,
one
but
way.
you're not out there paying
different
for
ways to update
Ansible or
Linux
something
systems.
either.
Sorry, Lee, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, you're not out there paying for a product or an Ansible or a Puppet or anything like that. You've got
Ansible, Puppet, Chef. I could use those to do this as well.
Yeah, but this is cool.
I'm sure it's a default setting, but what's your etc doers look like? Because you're not logged in as root right now.
It will ask you for sudo privileges in all the systems, Jeff. Yeah, it will.
I'm just thinking about what would happen if there's a CrowdStrike update and all that. So maybe we should talk about your endpoint protection.
Well,
yeah,
it's Linux. Who hacks Linux? Come on.
I'm just thinking if there was a bad thing in the update, you have this great automatic script to destroy all your systems all at once.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's user assisted. When I run topgrade, Sam, it's running the commands and letting me interact.
Yeah, but you always read what's on the prompt.
Me. Well, actually, I do. Yes. When it goes and updates, like I read it and it'll say, "Hey, I'm updating Grub," and I'm like, "Okay, maybe I need to stop. Maybe I need to go research it. It could blow up my system." So I mean, it's automating the process, but there's still a human involved to say yes or no if I want to update. So.
But conversely, you're not logging discretely in each system, remembering the commands you need to run to do those updates and or making sure you got everything covered.
Right. And
That's
also, these are
done.
not mission critical systems either, right? Like I've got a couple of systems that run my Tailscale and Pi-hole that live in a cloud provider. I've got 2 jump boxes at the studio for remote access. So like I have 2 of them just for that reason. If one blows up, I have 2 DNS and DHCP servers at the studio. So like if one blows up, so even when I run topgrade, I may go, yeah, update one of them, but like skip the updates on the second one, so I can do the first one. So I've got redundancy built in. Again, like I have 4 desktop
that's an interesting
computers.
point. Can you group the top grade upgrades? Like do group 1, do group 2. So you have.
I don't think it. You know, that would be a great feature request for them.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah,
Because that way you could have your redundancy.
right.
If it's a mission critical thing, I can do group 1 now, wait a week, do group 2, etc.
Right. You can tell it which system to update on the command line. Yeah. So if I just want to update my local system, I use the remote host limit parameter to top grade, and it'll just do that. That's my local system, right? So I guess I could write a script that just does top grade with this. Yeah.
But it'd be really cool if they built that in their platform.
So what do you have on these systems in terms of EDR or antivirus or anti-malware?
Nothing yet. So just one last thing on updating, Jeff, before we get to that is when I update my kernel. So when you update your kernel, make sure you reboot is my advice. Also, what I like to do is I run all the updates. Maybe I reboot, get everything applied. Then I come back in, I go into Manjaro settings, and I look at my kernel and which kernels I have installed, which one's running, and which ones I might want to upgrade to. So you can see I've got 6.12 and 6.6 installed. Also, that's like 6.1, I think. So I keep at least 3 older kernels running or installed at all times in case I boot the latest one, which is 6.14, and it doesn't boot and something heinous happens. I can reboot, I can go in the grub menu, and I can fall back to a previous kernel, which I've had to do. Fortunately, not in some time, but I've had to do that before. I tend to go in and I don't run the LTS recommended. I run the next one up. So like LTS recommended right now for Manjaro 6.12, I'm running 6.14.6-2. I'll wait till that kernel gets at least to like a 0.1 release before I jump to it. You can see 6.15 is in there, but it's listed as experimental. I'm not running the experimental kernels. I'm running the stable kernels. I don't need the real-time kernels. You know, those are for specific applications. So 6.14 is a regular kernel, and has had quite a few point releases to it. So that's what I'm running right now. I find a much better desktop experience, certainly, running the latest kernels.
So I have a really dumb question real quick. What constitutes a different version of Linux? Is it a different kernel, or do different versions run off the same kernel?
I mean, technically, when we say Linux, it's the kernel, and your Linux distribution is the packaging of the kernel and userland software.
So Linux is the kernel. All these variations are all running off the same kernel, but they do different things to it.
Correct.
Is there a concept of end of life, end of support for older versions of the kernel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. The Linux kernel team will deprecate both kernels and support for older hardware.
Gotcha.
But the older hardware is not like Microsoft older hardware is like anything before an 8th gen Intel CPU. Linux older hardware is like, I think they just dropped support for 486 or something or Pentium, or like, you know what I mean? It goes much.
So Linux doesn't have similar issues to what Windows 11 rollouts might be encountering.
One of the reasons why people are promoting the Linux desktop, because the hardware support goes, I mean, like literally they just drop support for like Itanium or like super ancient hardware. In old file systems, what did they drop support for? One of the older file systems, RiserFS. I think it was RiserFS. It was like no one was using RiserFS anymore, and it just makes their job easier. And there's much better file systems out there than RiserFS. So, Yeah.
All right. So now let's transition. We're talking about perhaps putting Linux on the desktop, replacing desktop. Desktops traditionally need things, again, for certain frameworks, all sorts of antivirus, anti-malware, file integrity monitoring, intrusion detection, so on and so forth. What's Linux got to offer? I mean, and is it even necessary?
Well, I think it's necessary.
Okay.
So what I'm seeing on the threat landscape side are attackers going after Linux with like air quotes malware, right? Like forget about the initial infection vector. Like usually that's an RCE in the web interface or some kind of password or authentication credentials.
Well, similar to how it's
So they get out
done on the Windows side.
In the malware that they're dropping, it's interesting. I think JMagic and Tiny Shell are great examples of what we're seeing today in terms of Linux malware. So these are older utilities, not necessarily created with a malicious purpose, but people have maintained them over time, and then attackers have taken them and are using them in their tradecraft, right? Tiny Shell is a small little tiny shell. It could be completely legitimate, but attackers are using it. JMagic was that backdoor that was listening for specific packets and creating a backdoor channel. That's the kind of thing that we're seeing. And this is like my day job, right? They're not all that difficult to detect, to be quite honest. Like the Windows, I think we have a tougher time trying to figure out what malware is bypassing what. On Linux, it's pretty straightforward to detect most of this malware. Like you might get some false positives, but the behavior that's being exhibited can be picked up by simple tools, chkrootkit, the AIDE tripwire like thing. Sandfly is out there. They have rules to detect certain things. And, it's just basically looking at behaviors on the Linux system and just crafting not just signatures, but crafting ways to detect certain behaviors on Linux systems.
Is it fair to say that most Linux that's out there in production these days are servers versus desktops?
Yeah, there's not a lot of Linux user desktops.
Right.
However, there's a ton of Linux servers and a ton of Linux devices and or appliances.
So the malware, what we're calling malware, what you're describing as malware that's targeting Linux platforms, is necessarily targeting Linux servers. But
there's Linux servers. Like I put Linux on a server in the data center or in the cloud, and I'm running Linux.
Right.
But I deployed Avanti EPMM their enterprise management thing that got pwned recently. That runs Linux. It's a Linux appliance, but I deployed it as an Avanti either appliance in the cloud or physical appliance, right? Like your Sophos firewalls run Linux. Fortinet, they run Linux, but it's more proprietary. Palo Alto
but that brings
Linux.
up almost to me a separate thread of, granted there are a lot of appliances out there that are Linux based. Do all their security requirements that we're talking about in terms of servers necessarily need to apply to appliances? If the answer is yes, then it's the vendor responsibility to push updates. What can the user of the appliance do?
Well, and that's where our frustrations are is if you produce a IoT device or appliance that runs Linux, we don't have the right tools or visibility to do monitoring and forensics the same way we would in a Linux server.
Gotcha.
So we should definitely separate them. We're talking about Linux servers, and you want to monitor for malware, right? ClamAV is one. But then we run into the situation where we've researched it collectively and said, well, you need this, what was it called? I have it in the notes.
FA Notify.
FA Notify, which is like I don't know if it's a kernel module or driver or permissions that you have to give to ClamAV.
It's a kernel API, files. Whatever that means.
Okay.
But to back up and to set the stage a little bit, because we did talk about this ahead of time. PCI has a requirement in it that's been updated for version 4. It's been modernized, and so the emphasis is much more on malware versus what we used to just call viruses. But there's a requirement. It happens to be 5.3.2, which says you need to do one of two things. It's an either or. Either you need to have a tool in place that does periodic scanning and real time or on access, something's being executed, opened up, you scan it.
Yeah.
Or you do something that's doing continuous behavior analysis, which I think is more, the CrowdStrike type of stuff. ClamAV
EDR.
is apparently very problematic, and that's where this FA Notify comes into place for doing both a periodic scan of all the critical file systems and directories versus an on-demand, on-access type of scan. But the reason I was asking about server versus desktop is how many admins are logging on to these Linux servers, appliances or not, on the regular basis and doing the usual type of user activity, which generally launches malware into an environment in the first place. And if the presumption is not as much as just a user on a laptop or a desktop, how do we take that into consideration?
Yeah, I think Linux servers are under attack all the time. I mean, Linux desktops are too. I think there was just a Google Chrome vulnerability that affected Linux desktops, right? Which, given Chrome, would be a desktop, not a server. So that does happen, but malicious actors are going after Linux servers a lot. And so you need something to monitor logs, monitor for behavior on your Linux systems. And, maybe, so we can talk about, maybe it's a traditional, I have SentinelOne, I have CrowdStrike, right? And again,
ThreatLocker, I have some
we have some
variants.
EDR anti-malware solution. To me, like for an enterprise, that's going to be where it's at. There used to be like really awesome ones too. What was the one that got bought? Capsulate.
Oh, God,
Made software for monitoring Linux systems. So there's been some great solutions. There do exist the top, EDR, what we call vendors, and it's different, like antivirus, anti-malware versus EDR. Like there's differences there, right? So there's can I detect threats? And can I log the detection of those threats, right? That's more of like on the EDR kind of side of things. But there's also like, can I detect malware and then quarantine it in some way or do some preventative measure, right? So we have to separate detection from prevention. Like on Windows systems, I want to stop that malware from executing its payload and performing ransomware on all my systems. I want to have that quarantining capability. But you also want some of the detection capabilities as well. So I think you need both. And so that's where I come back to PCI, Jeff. I'm not quite sure what they're recommending go on Linux systems. Do I need to scan and just to detect things, or does it need to scan and be able to actively quarantine or take an action?
No,
it's
very specifically stating both.
Okay.
Both prevent malware from persisting, but also preventing execution, and that's apparently a stumbling block for most of the freeware solutions that are out there.
Now, I haven't done a deep dive on this, but years ago, in talking with people who were actively researching and testing EDR antivirus software, they said that they'll support Windows, like any vendor, right? Will support Windows, and they'll also support Linux, and they'll also support macOS. And sometimes what happens is they kind of just sort of port their Windows to macOS or Linux, so the detection's not great. Like their bread and butter is Windows. They have to support macOS or Linux because customers are asking. So they just kind of quickly port whatever Windows stuff they have to macOS or to Linux. And it ends up being not as effective on Windows as it is on other platforms. So it's not a great solution for macOS or Linux. I don't remember which vendors those were. I don't know how it's changed over time. I know that the major players in EDR, like the ones that come to mind, because some of the ones I use, like I've seen CrowdStrike, I've seen SentinelOne, I've seen Bitdefender on Linux servers, and even sometimes on Linux appliances as well, which is super interesting. But sticking with Linux servers,
Right.
I would recommend, if you want to be PCI compliant, to use one of the major vendors that like take the one you're licensing for your Windows systems and evaluate it on Linux.
Well, I've even had a client apparently that is successfully meeting this requirement. They've been able, of course, they have very few Linux servers, which I don't know if that makes a difference, but
I think it does. Yeah.
they're using Windows Defender. Apparently, that ports to Linux.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing that.
So there's a slight nuance I was running into with formerly being in a CrowdStrike shop, and that was that CrowdStrike supports a whole bunch of Linux distributions. All right, it's the long list. The question is how well. Like, we would always run into this case where the latest Fedora, which we're qualifying it for enterprise use, the newest version, the level of support was not as deep at the kernel level for the latest kernels. Use the redundancy as the more mature, slightly older ones. Over time, that changes because they update the product, of course. And so if you're a shop like Paul's shop, I suspect, regardless of the product, by the way, I'm not picking on CrowdStrike. I'm just using it as an example.
Yes, you are.
No, actually, I'm not, because we talked to him about this, and it was like, oh, okay, well, it's as fast as you can go. But more importantly is to understand the limits. I mean, if you're bound by something like a PCI, and you don't understand that you're going to be leapfrogging and you're really moving forward aggressively with your product. Although I suspect in a PCI environment, you don't have an aggressive product update schedule. Like, you're not on the latest Fedora or the latest Arch or whatever. Pick your flavor. Right. It's a little more stable.
It's going. I would imagine payment processing.
You bring up a great point, though. Defensive software in general that runs on Linux that needs or wants to live inside the kernel has to be compiled as a kernel driver.
Yes.
Same thing for Windows, right? We know CrowdStrike, inserts itself into the Windows kernel. Linux would be the similar process, but you have to compile it against the Linux kernel that's running on the system. And so if whatever Linux kernel you're running, you have to hope that whatever EDR provider you have makes software that's compiled against that kernel to insert the kernel module if it's living inside the kernel. SentinelOne, I think, has a dedicated agent but doesn't live inside the kernel. So these are like decisions that you have to make. There needs to be we need to find a study or someone to conduct a study about this, like march through actually testing this on Linux, like infecting systems with malware on Linux, like MITRE does. MITRE conducted a study for the Windows-based ones. I'm not sure if they did Linux, but it'd be interesting to know, like, hey, product A supports these Linux kernels, has a driver, and through our testing scored this way, right? Like, it'd be nice to have that data so we could have a solid recommendation, Jeff, especially for PCI folks.
Well, and I'm thinking it needs to be inclusive of all the various requirements in PCI that have to do with what I will very, very, very loosely call endpoint protection. And that's not even a good term, but I'm like, a lot of the requirements are, have been around in PCI for the 20-year history of PCI. They've evolved somewhat. For example, they used to call it file integrity monitoring. Now they call it change detection. And that's supposed to be a nod towards, modern solutions like EDRs and MDRs and XDRs and XYZ PDQDRs. Because apparently people can't extrapolate, well, this does something slightly different, but it meets the spirit of the requirement. The spirit of the requirement is looking for any unauthorized changes to anything you have installed on your system.
Correct.
Yeah. So here's a thing. So this is from Perplexity, right? So take it for what it's worth. It's an LLM. And I told it to compare SentinelOne to CrowdStrike.
Okay.
And so you can see SentinelOne, like, does it installs a kernel module? SentinelOne, no. CrowdStrike supports both. So you can do it as a kernel module, or if it's not supported, it'll have a user mode module. Now, how effective they are between the two, I can't answer that.
They're
I'm not sure
very
the LLM could
different.
answer that either, right?
They're very different strategies, mindset,
Right.
perspectives.
Right.
Correct.
It's
You-
going to depend how you architect your systems as to which one you pick.
Right.
Yeah,
It could also be, what I always tell people is like, if let's say you have Sentinel-1 as an example, and I've got that deployed to 10,000 Windows desktops, and my team is super awesome at managing Sentinel-1, at tuning the rules, at responding to it, at integrating it into our entire security stack. My recommendation for that company is, if you're looking to protect your Linux systems, go use Sentinel-1.
Yeah.
Sure, kernel versus not, like, detection might be off, but you know how to manage and tune and tweak Sentinel-1. To me, that's more important, more effective in your security strategy than going to find that one-off maybe tool. Although, when I say that, when I look at Sandfly, we were looking at that yesterday. Sandfly is great. It agentless SSH logs into all your system and looks for threats.
Perfect.
But it's priced like super, I don't want to say super cheap because that makes it sound, it's the value you get is awesome because it's not super expensive to protect your Linux system. So that maybe, for critical systems, you want to, have an extra layer of protection. So
I would put a caveat on that because that's really good advice, Paul. I would say start with the thing you know, upside down,
Right.
in and out, etc. Which back at my shop we were at the time a semantic AV shop, and this is pre-EDR. But when it came to our Linux system, they had a Linux client.
Yep.
But it wasn't packaged for enterprise deployment. It was packaged for a sysadmin installing one at a time,
Right.
even with
for a
a
desktop,
Puppet or other. But when you put it into LANDesk or something to try and deploy the enterprise, it was horrible.
Right.
So then you go on to the other tools, like the one, whether it's an inexpensive one like you described, or you go out for
Great point, Lee. Yep.
Yeah. But I would definitely, just like you said, I start with what you know and
Start
love,
with what
because
you
you're
know.
not having to, it's just a little different environment. You don't have to
Right.
start over with what the hell is
Something
a
all new.
Sentinel-1
Yeah.
or, pick your flavor. But definitely understand that, and also understand what they support, Oh yeah, well, we're only
because the
going
nice part about like my day job, Eclipsium or Sandfly, so where we're going in Eclipsium is the same direction, right? If you can log into it via SSH, we can tell you something about vulnerabilities and threats on that system, which means it can be an IoT camera, it can be a appliance of some kind. I think we both advertise we support Cisco and Juniper because we can SSH into those systems and we can tell you certain things. And we're working on some amazing features in that realm that'll be coming out throughout the year. But that's stuff to consider. Is when you think about Linux, it's not just your servers, it's also your appliances.
There's so many things to consider. Agent versus agentless, pros and cons. Agentless
a
means
lot of people don't like the agent because they don't want it messing up their systems.
They don't want to mess up their systems. They don't want
that's the Sandfly approach. That's our approach too, right? We're just going to log into your system remotely via SSH. Sometimes they also have an agent. So we have an agent option more tuned for your servers and desktops because we have to, in order to do what we do to get that deep inspection on UEFI, we have to take a snapshot of the spy flash. In order to do that, we need a kernel driver. And so that's why for Windows and Linux systems, you can deploy our kernel driver. It installs, it gives the right privileges to take a snapshot of the spy flash. And then we can tell you about all things about your secure boot configuration, your UEFI configuration. That higher level of privileges lets us look at your TPM. It lets us determine microcode, things like that.
Are you doing that every time, or is that like a baseline? Do it once every once in a while. And then
you can schedule it for as often as you want. Yeah.
So you just basically said that you're a rootkit.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Some people might object to that versus just having an agent installed, where you at least it's there.
This is the whole reason that that outage from Microsoft.
Correct.
that happened because they had
But big difference. CrowdStrike's kernel driver is a specific one that gets loaded very early in the kernel boot process. Eclipseum's kernel driver, we load it much later.
Okay.
So we would never have that CrowdStrike issue on Windows systems because we're not loading the driver that early, because we don't need to load it that early. CrowdStrike does. I mean, I'm not saying CrowdStrike is crap.
You could have
CrowdStrike has a great
issues.
reason. They have a great reason to do that. You want to catch threads as early in the kernel, process loading as you need to. So it needs to be there. I agree with that. We don't need to be there, so we don't have that level of capability. We load after the OS fully boots, and then drop it in.
And you did that deliberately for that reason. Good job.
Right. Yeah.
If I were a vendor, I'd say make sure you have both options. Stay out of because in the customer space, you don't only have the whether it's the impact, but also you sidestep the whole credential management. What if you're getting into fights over having a credential that can log into all those systems via SSH? You don't want to get into that fight with the customer.
That's why
an option.
That's why us and many other vendors support integration with credential vaults and credential access.
You can
PAM
use a PAM
systems.
solution to do that. But but that assumes that they're at that level of maturity by giving them options so you can support multiple. Correct. You don't have to care where they are. I can help you out here. Don't worry. It's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a difference, I think, between what's cheaper or what costs more versus what's a security best practice. And I think there's probably religious differences on agentless versus agent, and we probably can't solve that. But I guess I'm leaning towards what Lee says is, have both options so that for whatever reasons, people can pick the best option from a security perspective. Right. Although reality is most organizations I deal with, they're going to do whatever's cheaper and leave it at that.
And it's not just PCI that's requiring the EDR or anti-malware. I know in various places
all I see
we've
is
had
PCI.
to install.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But in other like certain circumstances, we have to install certain anti-malware or EDR on Linux systems to be compliant with, I don't remember what it was. FedRAMP, maybe? No. Well, Josh, what are the cloud ones? What's the cloud one?
Might be ISO or SOC 2.
Something.
FedRAMP is for federal work, it's the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is the cloud one. And for
what's the one where I certify my product in the cloud?
FISMA FedRAMP.
Same.
Cloud service providers.
SOC 2? Is it SOC?
No, SOC 2 is for customer data and data in general.
Okay.
Anyway,
there's whatever the compliance standards are. Maybe that's a future episode to talk about which one of those you require. You're going to run into this outside of PCI.
God, yes.
Well, and PCI tries to be as neutral as possible in terms of how you meet the requirement. For better or for worse. Some people think it's very prescriptive, but especially in version 4, they've gone to great lengths to say, meet the spirit of the requirement. And in fact, here's what the spirit of the requirement is. And they not only do they give you what they've always allowed, which is compensating controls. We're not quite making it, but we're doing other things to make up for it. They also allow for now what they're calling a customized approach. We just do this differently than what you have it spelled out. So they give the opportunity to write up basically your own testing procedures and your own requirement that meets the spirit, and they state this is what your objective is.
Yeah.
Show us that you're doing it a different way, and you're fine.
Right. You may also have an MSP or MSSP. Maybe protecting your Windows systems. Hey, compliance wants to protect our Linux systems. Maybe they use the same solution. Maybe they use a different one for your Linux systems, but you're going to use what your MSSP.
It's funny. I have a story that we covered last week on the news segment that kind of talks about the reliance of pushing things out to MSPs and third parties and the limitations of that. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode news segment, you should do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank all of you.
2 weeks ago.
It'll be 2 weeks ago now.
No, right? I'm speaking in a future perspective.
In the future.
Like,
okay.
Tonight we're going to talk about this story.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
I'm so
thank
I
you.
will have done.
Thank you, everyone.
It's Bill and
for listening
Ted's
and
Excellent
watching.
Adventure.
That's it. It is. Thanks for everyone who participated in the show today.
Yeah, Paul, let's all do the Scooby-Doo outing.
Yes, right.
God.
It's been a great pre-record. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please come find us. I'm always happy to talk about Linux. I think everyone else is too. So thanks, everyone. See you next time. Over and out.